Sometimes the deepest wounds are the ones nobody can see. For 15 years, Cole Travis has carried his grief like a stone in his chest, refusing to let another woman into his broken heart. The old cowboy thought his story was over when he buried his wife Annie beneath the wild sage. But when he finds Clara Jessup stranded on the dusty road outside Dry Hollow, something stirs in him that he thought was dead and gone. She's a widow too, traveling alone with her own quiet pain. As they sit by the campfire under a blanket of stars, Cole finally speaks the words that have haunted him for years. "I haven't spoken to a woman since I buried my last one. But can two broken hearts find healing in each other's company?" Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across the Travis ranch as Cole stepped out onto his weathered porch, coffee mug in hand. The ritual was the same, every day for 15 years. Black coffee, no sugar, standing in the exact spot where Annie used to water her morning glories. The flowers were long dead now, their wooden stakes still marking empty dirt like small tombstones. He sipped the bitter brew and surveyed his land with eyes that had seen too much sorrow. The ranch stretched out before him like a faded photograph, all the color bleached out by time and loneliness. His cattle grazed in distant pastures, content in their simple lives, while the barn stood solid against the horizon, its red paint peeling like old skin. Cole was nearly 60 now, his hair more silver than brown, his face carved by wind and weather into something resembling the canyon walls that bordered his property. His hands, thick and scarred from decades of ranch work, wrapped around the ceramic mug Annie had made in town years ago. He dropped it once, 2 years after she died, and carefully glued the pieces back together. The cracks were still visible, a spider web of lines that reminded him daily of how broken things never quite looked the same once mended. The people of Dry Hollow understood Cole's silence. After Annie's passing from the fever that took her so quickly, he'd simply stopped speaking to women. Not rudely, Cole Travis had been raised better than that, but with a polite distance that made it clear he wasn't looking for conversation, companionship, or anything else they might offer. The shopkeeper's wife would nod when he bought supplies. The preacher's daughter would smile when he tipped his hat after Sunday service. The widow Henderson had tried for years to bring him casseroles and conversation, but Cole had learned to accept the food with a grateful nod and return the empty dishes clean, never lingering long enough for her hopes to take root. Inside his cabin, beneath the loose floorboards by Annie's old sewing chair, lay her diarrhea leather-bound book he'd never found the courage to open. He knew it was there, had seen her writing in it during those final weeks when the fever made her sleep fitful and her thoughts scattered. Sometimes, in the deep of night when sleep wouldn't come, he'd think about reading her last words, but 15 years of thinking hadn't built him the strength to actually do it. The cabin itself was a monument to preservation. Annie's shawl still hung on the peg by the door. Her books remained on the shelf in the same order she'd arranged them. Her favorite teacup sat on the kitchen shelf, washed but unused. Cole had become the curator of a life that existed only in memory, tending to objects that no longer served any purpose except to prove she had once been real. His daily routine was as fixed as the sunrise: feed the cattle, check the fences, repair what needed repairing, eat simple meals alone at a table set for one. In the evenings, he'd sit on the porch with his pipe, watching the sky change colors while the crickets sang their ancient songs. Sometimes he'd catch himself looking down the dusty road that led to town, wondering what it would be like if someone came riding up that path with news or needs or simple human company. But the road stayed empty, and Cole stayed alone, and that was how he'd built his world to work. Then Clara Jessup appeared on that road like an answer to a prayer he'd never thought to pray. She was traveling in a small, covered wagon, pulled by 2 horses that looked as road-weary as their owner. Cole first spotted her from his porch around midday, the sun high and merciless overhead. Even from a distance, he could see something was wrong. The wagon tilted at an odd angle, one wheel clearly damaged beyond the ability to continue. Clara was perhaps 40, with dark hair pulled back under a simple bonnet and a traveling dress that had seen too many miles of dust. She wasn't beautiful in the way that would stop men's conversations in saloons, but there was something about the set of her shoulders and the way she examined her broken wheel that spoke of a quiet strength. She didn't wail or wring her hands or call out for rescue. She simply stood beside her wagon, hands on her hips, considering her options with the practical calm of someone who'd faced difficulties before. Cole watched from his porch for nearly an hour, fighting with himself. His instinct was to help. That's how he'd been raised. How any decent man should respond to someone in need. But helping meant talking. And talking to a woman meant breaking 15 years of careful distance. He could ride into town and send back help, let someone else handle the situation. That would be the safe choice, the choice that kept his walls intact. But as the afternoon wore on and no other travelers appeared on the road, Cole found himself saddling his horse, despite his reservations. Annie had always said that kindness was a duty, not a choice, and some lessons went deeper than grief. "Ma'am," he said as he rode up, touching the brim of his hat in the way his father had taught him. His voice sounded strange to his own ears. It had been months since he'd spoken to anyone, except the preacher or the shopkeeper, and longer still since he'd addressed a woman directly. Clara looked up from where she knelt beside the broken wheel, her brown eyes meeting his with a directness that surprised him. "Good afternoon," she said. Her voice carried the faint accent of someone from back east, refined but not pretentious. "I seem to have encountered some difficulty." The understatement made Cole almost smile. The wheel wasn't just broken, it was completely shattered, split wood scattered in the dust like kindling. "Yes, ma'am, I can see that. I'm Cole Travis. This is my land here." "Clara Jessup," she replied, standing and brushing dust from her skirt. "I was hoping to make it to town before nightfall, but I suppose that plan needs revision." Her practical tone put Cole at ease in a way he hadn't expected. There was no flutter or artifice in her manner, no attempt to appear helpless to elicit his protection. She stated facts and accepted circumstances without drama, and something about that reminded him of Annie's own no-nonsense approach to life's challenges. "Dry Hollow's another 8 miles, Cole said, studying the broken wheel. "This wagon's not making that journey without major repairs. Wheelwright there could fix it, but it'd take him the better part of 2 days, assuming he has the right wood in stock." Clara nodded, absorbing this information without visible distress. "Then I suppose I'll need to make arrangements for temporary lodging. Is there an inn in town?" "Mrs. Patterson takes in travelers sometimes," Cole said, though he was already thinking about the logistics. "But getting you there without a wagon means leaving everything behind, and these horses need water and rest." For a long moment, they stood in the dusty road, 2 strangers taking each other's measure. Clara seemed to be calculating her options, while Cole found himself doing something he hadn't done in 15 years, considering inviting a woman to stay on his land. "I have a barn," he heard himself saying. "It's clean and dry. You could shelter there tonight, rest your horses. In the morning I could take you to town to arrange repairs." The offer hung in the air between them, like something fragile that might break if either of them breathed wrong. Clara studied his face, perhaps reading the discomfort that making such an offer cost him. "That's very kind, Mr. Travis," she said finally. "I accept with gratitude." As they worked together to move her wagon to his barn, Cole learned the basic facts of Clara Jessup's story. She was a widow, her husband killed in a mining accident in Kansas 2 years prior. She was traveling to California, where a cousin had offered her work, managing a boarding house in Sacramento. She carried her life in that small wagon, clothes, books, a few precious mementos, and hopes for a fresh start in a place where no one knew her as the woman who'd lost her husband to bad luck and unstable mine shafts. That evening, as the sun painted the sky in shades of amber and rose, they sat by a small fire Cole built near the barn. Clara had insisted on preparing their simple meal beans and hardtack from her supplies, coffee strong enough to float a horseshoe. She moved with quiet efficiency, and Cole found himself watching her hands as she worked, noting the calluses that spoke of a life that hadn't been easy even before tragedy struck. "You mentioned you hadn't spoken to a woman since you buried your last one," Clara said as they ate, her voice gentle but direct. "How long ago was that?" The question should have made Cole retreat into his shell, should have triggered all the defenses he'd built over the years. Instead, he found himself answering honestly. 15 years come October. Annie died of fever. Quick and cruel she was, fine Monday, gone by Friday. Clara nodded, understanding flickering in her eyes. Thomas was crushed in a cave, one moment there, the next. She paused, then continued. "I understand the silence. After he died, I found it difficult to speak to anyone who hadn't lost what I'd lost. Other people's lives seemed so impossibly normal. They sat in comfortable quiet after that, the fire crackling between them while night settled over the ranch. Above them, stars emerged one by one, more visible here than they'd ever been in town. Cole felt something loosening in his chest, some long-held tension beginning to ease in the presence of someone who understood grief without needing explanation. "What was she like?" Clara asked eventually. "Annie." Cole was quiet so long that Clara might have thought he hadn't heard the question. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft as prayer. "She laughed like music. Always saw the good in things, even when there wasn't much good to see. She could make a wildflower garden bloom in ground that looked too poor to grow weeds." He paused, his hand unconsciously moving to his vest pocket where her wedding ring rested. "She used to say that love wasn't about finding someone perfect, but about finding someone whose imperfections fit with yours like puzzle pieces." Clara smiled at that, the firelight catching the expression and making it warm. "She sounds like she was wise." "Wiser than me, that's certain," Cole said. "I've spent 15 years trying to honor her memory by staying loyal to grief, starting to wonder if maybe that's not what she would have wanted." It was the most honest thing he'd said to another human being in longer than he could remember, and saying it to a woman he'd just met should have felt wrong. Instead, it felt like the first right thing he'd done in years. Morning came too soon, and not soon enough. Cole woke before dawn, as was his habit, but instead of his usual solitary coffee ritual, he found himself listening for sounds from the barn. The knowledge that someone else was on his property, a woman, no Lashad, kept his sleep light and restless. Every night sound seemed amplified, the horses shifting in their stalls, the wind through the eaves, the settling of old wood. He dressed quietly and stepped outside to find Clara already awake, standing beside her wagon, examining the broken wheel in the early light. She'd changed from her traveling dress into a simpler work dress, more practical for the day ahead. Her hair was braided back, and she held a tin cup of coffee that steamed in the cool morning air. "Good morning, Mr. Travis," she said without turning around. "I hope I didn't wake you. I'm an early riser by nature." "No, ma'am, you didn't wake me," Cole replied, approaching with his own coffee. "I'm generally up before the roosters myself. How'd you sleep?" "Better than I have in weeks, actually. There's something peaceful about this place." She gestured toward the broken wheel with her cup. "I've been examining this in better light. I'm afraid my assessment was overly optimistic yesterday. This wheel isn't just damaged, it's completely destroyed." Cole crouched down to examine the wheel more closely. In daylight, the damage was even worse than it had appeared the evening before. The wooden spokes were splintered beyond repair, the iron rim bent out of true, and the hub was cracked through. This wasn't something that could be mended with rope and hope. "You're right," he said, standing and dusting off his hands. "This wheel is finished. The wheelwright in town will need to build you a completely new one from scratch." Clara sighed, a sound that carried more resignation than frustration. "How long might that take?" "Pete Morrison's a good craftsman, but he's thorough. A wheel like this, built proper to handle rough roads? 4 days, maybe 5 if he's backed up with other work." The reality of her situation settled between them like dust from a passing storm. Clara would need to remain in Dry Hollow nearly a week, dependent on the kindness of strangers in a town where she knew no one. The boarding house arrangement Cole had mentioned seemed increasingly necessary. "There's something else," Clara said, reaching into her wagon and withdrawing a small object wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it carefully, revealing a silver pocket watch that caught the morning light. "This was my husband's. I've been carrying it since he died, but I think it might be time to consider selling it to pay for the repairs and lodging." Cole recognized the weight of what she was showing him. The watch was clearly precious to her, not just for its monetary value, but for the connection it represented to her lost husband. The idea of her selling such a personal treasure to pay for basic necessities sat wrong with him. "Mrs. Jessup," he said carefully, "I'd like to make you a different offer." Clara looked up from the watch, her brown eyes curious but guarded. "You could stay here while the wheel's being repaired," Cole continued, the words coming easier than he'd expected. "The barn's comfortable enough, and I could use the company for meals. In exchange, maybe you could help with some of the household tasks that have gotten away from me over the years. That way you keep your husband's watch, and I get help with things I've been neglecting." The offer surprised them both. Cole hadn't planned to make it, hadn't even realized he was considering it, until the words left his mouth. But looking at Clara clutching her husband's watch, he knew it was the right thing to do, regardless of how it complicated his carefully ordered solitude. Clara studied his face for a long moment, perhaps trying to read his motivations. "Mr. Travis, that's extraordinarily generous, but I wouldn't want to impose on your privacy. You've already done more than most would." "It's not an imposition if I'm offering," Cole said. "Besides, Annie always said this ranch was too big for one person to manage properly. Maybe she was right." The mention of his wife's name seemed to settle something for Clara. She nodded slowly, rewrapping the pocket watch with careful reverence. "Then I accept, with gratitude, but I insist on earning my keep properly. I'm not looking for charity." "Wouldn't offer charity to someone who could work," Cole said. "Annie used to manage the vegetable garden, keep the house organized, handle the mending and such. Those tasks have been neglected since she passed. If you're willing to tackle some of that, we'll call it an even trade." They spent the morning riding into Dry Hollow together, Clara seated beside Cole on his horse, while her own animals remained at the ranch to rest. The town was small but bustling, with a main street lined with the essential businesses of frontier life. General store, saloon, church, blacksmith, and Pete Morrison's wheelwright shop. Pete was a weathered man in his 50s, with hands permanently stained by wood and metal work. He examined the broken wheel pieces Cole brought him and whistled low. "That's a proper wreck," Pete said, turning one of the larger wheel fragments over in his hands. "What happened to it?" "Mrs. Jessup here hit a particularly nasty rut yesterday," Cole explained. "She needs a replacement built from scratch." Pete looked at Clara with the evaluating gaze of a craftsman, estimating his work. "I can build you a fine wheel, ma'am, but it won't be quick work. 4 days minimum, possibly 5. And it won't be cheap goods. Seasoned wood doesn't come free." Clara nodded, understanding the reality of her situation. "What would be the cost, Mr. Morrison?" Pete quoted a price that made Clara's face tighten slightly, though she maintained her composure. It wasn't ruinous, but Cole could see it would strain her resources considerably. "Put it on my account, Pete," Cole said quietly. "Mr. Travis, I couldn't," Clara began, but Cole held up a hand. "We'll settle up privately," he said. "Pete, how soon can you start?" "I'll begin this afternoon," Pete promised. "Should have it ready by Saturday, Lord willing and the wood cooperates." As they prepared to leave the wheelwright's shop, Cole noticed the way Clara's hand moved unconsciously to her pocket, where she kept her husband's watch. The gesture spoke of relief and gratitude, but also of something else perhaps, the recognition that accepting help meant accepting a kind of dependence she wasn't accustomed to. The ride back to the ranch was quieter than their morning journey had been. Clara seemed lost in thought, perhaps processing the reality that she would be staying in this place, with this man, for nearly a week. For Cole, the silence felt different than the solitude he'd grown accustomed to. This was a companionable quiet, the kind that exists between people who don't need to fill every moment with words. "Mr. Travis," Clara said as they approached the ranch, "may I ask you something personal?" Cole tensed slightly but nodded. I reckon so. In 15 years, you've never been tempted to remarry. A man with land and a good reputation must have had opportunities. The question was one Cole had expected might come eventually, though he'd hoped to avoid it longer. There were some who made their interest known, he admitted. But I made a promise to Annie when she was dying, told her she was the only woman I'd ever love, and I meant it. Clara was quiet for a moment, considering his words. That's a heavy promise to carry for so long. Heavy promises are the only kind worth making, Cole said, though even as he spoke the words, he wondered if he truly believed them anymore. That evening, as they sat by another fire under the vast Montana sky, Clara shared more of her own story. She spoke of her marriage to Thomas, a gentleman who'd dreamed of striking it rich in the California goldfields, but had settled for the steadier work of mining copper in Kansas. She described their small house, their hopes for children that never came, and the crushing loneliness that followed his death. I never made promises about not loving again, she said, stirring the coals with a stick. Thomas wasn't the kind of man to ask for such a thing, but I haven't met anyone who made me want to try. The implication hung in the air between them, like smoke from their fire. Cole found himself studying Clara's profile in the firelight, noting the strength in her jaw and the sadness that lingered around her eyes. For the first time in 15 years, he wondered what it would be like to share his life with someone again, to have conversation and companionship and all the small intimacies that made a house into a home. The thought terrified him almost as much as it intrigued him. The third morning of Clara's stay dawned grey and heavy with the promise of rain. Cole found her in Annie's old vegetable garden, kneeling among the weeds with a rusted trowel she'd found in the barn. She'd already cleared a section of ground that hadn't seen proper attention in years, her work dress stained with honest dirt. "You don't waste time, do you?" Cole said, approaching with 2 cups of coffee. Clara accepted the coffee gratefully, sitting back on her heels to survey her progress. "I've never been one for idle hands. Besides, this garden has good bonesit, just needs someone to care for it again." Cole looked at the cleared patch with mixed emotions. Annie had loved this garden, had spent hours here in the early mornings and late evenings, coaxing vegetables and flowers from the stubborn Montana soil. After her death, he'd let it go wild, unable to bear the memory of her bent over the rows, humming old hymns while she worked. "Annie planted herbs along this edge," he said, pointing to where Clara had been working. "Sage, thyme, rosemary. Said they kept the rabbits away from the vegetables." "Did they work?" Clara asked, brushing a strand of hair from her face and leaving a smudge of dirt on her cheek. "Most of the time. Though I suspect the rabbits were just being polite to Annie. She had a way with living things." Clara smiled at that, continuing her work while Cole stood watching. There was something soothing about the rhythm of her movements, the methodical way she separated weeds from the few hardy plants that had survived years of neglect. Without quite deciding to, Cole found himself kneeling beside her, his larger hands joining hers in the soil. "This mint's trying to take over everything," he said, pulling up a tangle of aggressive runners. "Annie always said you had to be firm with mint, or it'd crowd out everything else in the garden." "Sounds like good advice for more than just gardening," Clara replied, and something in her tone made Cole look at her more closely. They worked in comfortable silence for an hour, their hands occasionally brushing as they reached for the same stubborn weed or worked to untangle plants that had grown together. Each accidental touch sent an unexpected jolt through Cole, a reminder of how long it had been since he'd shared physical space with another person in such an easy, natural way. When the first fat raindrops began to fall, they gathered their tools and hurried toward the cabin. Clara stumbled slightly on the uneven ground, and Cole's hand shot out instinctively to steady her. For a moment, they were very close, her hand resting on his arm, his fingers wrapped around her elbow. The rain began in earnest, but neither of them moved immediately. "Thank you," Clara said softly, and Cole realized she meant more than just his help avoiding a fall. They took shelter on the covered porch, watching the rain drum against the dusty ground and turn it to mud. The storm was fierce but brief. the kind that sweeps across the plains with dramatic intensity before moving on to bother someone else's sky. "Tell me about your husband," Cole said suddenly, surprising himself with the request. "What was he like?" Clara was quiet for a moment, perhaps deciding how much to share. "Thomas was gentle, too gentle maybe, for the kind of life we ended up living. He was a dreamer, always believing the next claim would be the one, the next opportunity would make us rich. He had faith in possibilities I couldn't see." "Sounds like he loved you." "He did, and I loved him, though not always in the way he deserved. I was practical where he was hopeful, cautious where he was brave. Sometimes I wonder if I held him back from the adventures he really wanted." Cole understood the weight of such wondering. "Do you think he'd want you to spend the rest of your life regretting what you did or didn't do?" The question seemed to catch Clara off guard. She looked at him with something like surprise, as if she hadn't expected such insight from a man who'd spent 15 years frozen in his own regrets. "No," she said finally. "Thomas would want me to be happy. He'd probably be frustrated that it's taken me 2 years to even try." "Annie used to say that guilt was just love with no place to go," Cole said, his voice barely audible above the lessening rain. "Never really understood what she meant until after she was gone." Clara reached out then, her hand covering his where it rested on the porch rail. The gesture was simple, brief, but it carried more weight than any words could have managed. For just a moment, Cole allowed himself to feel the warmth of human comfort, the reassurance of not being completely alone with his thoughts. When the rain stopped, they returned to the garden, working side by side as the afternoon sun brought out the rich scent of wet earth. Clara shared stories of her life in Kansas, the small house she and Thomas had shared, the neighbors who'd become like family, the difficult decision to leave everything familiar behind and head west. Cole found himself talking about the ranch, about the years he and Annie had spent building it from nothing. He told Clara about the harsh winter when they'd nearly lost everything, how Annie had insisted they share their dwindling supplies with a neighbor family whose husband had been injured. He described the spring when Annie had planted her first successful flower garden, how she'd danced between the rows of blooming daffodils like a girl half her age. "She sounds like she was joyful," Clara said, carefully transplanting a volunteer tomato plant that had sprouted in the wrong location. "She was, even when times were hard, especially when times were hard. Used to say that joy was a choice you made every morning, not something that just happened to you. That's a hard philosophy to live by when you're grieving." Cole paused in his work, a handful of weeds suspended over the basket they'd been filling. "I suppose I convinced myself that staying sad was the same as staying faithful to her memory. Like letting go of the grief would mean letting go of the love. And now—" Cole looked at Clara, really looked at her, taking in the way the late afternoon light caught the gold threads in her brown hair, the smudge of dirt on her cheek, the gentle competence of her hands as she worked with Annie's plants. "Now I'm starting to think maybe I've been confusing sorrow with loyalty." That evening, as they prepared their simple supper together, Cole found himself watching Clara move around Annie's kitchen with something approaching wonder. She didn't try to fill Annie's place or copy her methods, but she brought her own quiet efficiency to the space, her own way of making the cabin feel lived in rather than preserved. After they ate, Clara produced a deck of worn playing cards from her traveling bag. "Thomas taught me to play poker," she said with a slight smile, "though I suspect he let me win more often than he should have." They played by lamplight, small stakes of matchsticks and buttons, their conversation meandering from serious to playful and back again. Cole found himself laughing, actually laughing for the first time in longer than he could remember. Clara had a dry sense of humor and a talent for gentle teasing that drew responses from him he'd forgotten he was capable of making. When they finally said goodnight and Clara returned to her makeshift quarters in the barn, Cole sat alone on his porch longer than usual. The night was clear after the rain, stars scattered across the sky like scattered coins. For the first time in 15 years, the silence didn't feel complete. It felt like it was waiting for something, pregnant with possibilities he was only beginning to imagine. By the fourth day of Clara's stay, word had spread through Dry Hollow like wildfire in August grass. In a town where the arrival of a new traveling preacher was front-page news for weeks, the presence of a woman staying at Cole Travis's ranch was the kind of gossip that made tongues wag from the general store to the church steps. Cole became aware of the attention during his weekly trip to town for supplies. He'd invited Clara to accompany him, thinking she might want to purchase a few items for her continued journey to California. What he hadn't anticipated was walking into Hendrick's general store with a woman at his side for the first time in 15 years. The conversation in the store died the moment they entered. Mrs. Patterson, the boarding house keeper, looked up from examining a bolt of calico with the sharp interest of a hawk spotting prey. Young Billy Hendricks, who usually greeted Cole with easy familiarity, suddenly found the contents of a pickle barrel fascinating. Even old Jim Walker, who spent most mornings in the store's chairs solving the world's problems, stopped mid-sentence and stared. "Morning, folks," Cole said, his voice carrying just a touch more volume than necessary. "Mrs. Jessup here needs a few supplies for her travels." The introduction seemed to break the spell. Mrs. Patterson stepped forward with the kind of smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Mrs. Jessup, is it? I'm Margaret Patterson. I run the boarding house here in town. I don't believe we've been properly introduced." Clara returned the smile with one that was genuine but cautious. "Clara Jessup, I'm very pleased to meet you, Mrs. Patterson. Mr. Travis mentioned you take in travelers." "Indeed I do, though I understood you were staying out at the Travis ranch while your wagon was being repaired." Mrs. Patterson's tone managed to make it sound like both a question and an accusation. "That's correct," Clara replied evenly. "Mr. Travis has been very generous in offering shelter while Pete Morrison works on my wheel." "How convenient," Mrs. Patterson said, and the way she said it made Clara's cheeks flush slightly. Cole felt something hot and protective rise in his chest. "Mrs. Jessup has been helpful with some ranch work that's gotten away from me over the years," he said, his tone carrying a warning that the older woman chose to ignore. "I'm sure she has," Mrs. Patterson replied, "though I do hope you're being properly chaperoned out there. Appearances matter, even on the frontier." The implication hung in the air like smoke from a poorly tended fire. Cole felt his jaw tighten, but before he could respond, Clara stepped forward slightly, her chin raised in quiet dignity. "Mrs. Patterson, I appreciate your concern for propriety," Clara said, her voice calm but firm. "I can assure you that Mr. Travis has been nothing but a perfect gentleman. I've been sleeping in the barn, and our arrangement is purely one of mutual convenience and Christian charity." The exchange drew more attention from other customers, and Cole could practically feel the weight of their judgment settling on his shoulders. He'd lived in this town for most of his adult life, had earned respect through hard work and honest dealing, but he could see that 15 years of careful distance from women had made his current situation seem suspicious to some. "Of course, dear," Mrs. Patterson said, though her tone suggested she wasn't entirely convinced. "I simply worry about a woman traveling alone. These are dangerous times, and reputation is so important for a lady." The conversation continued in this vein for several more uncomfortable minutes, with Mrs. Patterson and a few other women who'd gathered offering advice and thinly veiled criticism in equal measure. Clara handled it all with grace that Cole found remarkable, neither defensive nor apologetic, simply stating facts with quiet dignity. It was when they were leaving the store that Cole overheard the comment that made his blood boil. "Always knew that hermit act was too good to last," one of the men said to his companion. "Man gets lonely enough, he'll take up with any woman who'll have him." Cole stopped so abruptly that Clara nearly walked into his back. He turned around slowly, his face a mask of controlled fury. The speaker was Jake Morrison, Pete, the wheelwright's youngest brother, a man, known more for his drinking than his wisdom. "You have something to say to me, Jake?" Cole asked, his voice deceptively quiet. Jake Morrison had the sense to look uncomfortable under Cole's steady gaze, but he'd had just enough whiskey for breakfast to make him stubborn. "Nothing personal, Cole. Just observing that 15 years is a long time to go without female companionship." "Jake," Cole said, taking a step closer, "you'd do well to remember that you're talking about a lady, and in front of that lady, I'd suggest you keep your observations to yourself." The confrontation might have escalated, but Clara placed a gentle hand on Cole's arm. "Mr. Travis," she said quietly, "perhaps we should continue with our errands." Cole looked down at her, seeing the mix of embarrassment and gratitude in her eyes. She was handling the situation with more grace than he was, trying to diffuse the tension rather than escalate it. With an effort that felt physical, he stepped back from Jake Morrison. "You're right," he said to Clara, then looked back at Jake. "But if I hear any more disrespectful talk about Mrs. Jessup, we'll finish this conversation in a different way." As they walked to their next stop, the church where Cole had promised to drop off some lumber for repairs, Clara was unusually quiet. "I'm sorry about that," Cole said finally. "Jake Morrison's got more mouth than sense on his best days, and this isn't one of his best days." "It's not your fault," Clara replied. "I knew there would be talk. A woman traveling alone always draws attention, and staying with a man, even under innocent circumstances, makes it worse. Doesn't make it right." Clara touched her mother's cameo brooch at her throat, a gesture Cole was beginning to recognize as a sign that she was thinking carefully about her words. "In my experience, Mr. Travis, people will think what they choose to think regardless of the truth. The only thing that matters is that we know our conduct has been proper." At the church, they encountered a different kind of reception. Reverend Matthews was a kind man in his 60s who'd known Cole since he was a boy. He greeted Clara warmly and without judgment, inquiring about her travels and offering assistance if she needed anything during her stay in town. "Cole, here's one of our most reliable members," the Reverend told Clara as they prepared to leave. "If he's vouching for you, that's good enough for me. You're welcome at Sunday service if you're still in town." The contrast between the Reverend's warm acceptance and the cool judgment they'd faced elsewhere wasn't lost on either of them. As they loaded their supplies into Cole's wagon, Clara seemed to be wrestling with something. "Mr. Travis," she said finally, "if my presence at your ranch is causing you difficulty with your neighbors, perhaps I should reconsider Mrs. Patterson's boarding house." Cole stopped what he was doing and looked at her directly. "Clara," he said, using her first name without thinking, "if I cared more about gossip than about doing what's right, I wouldn't have offered you shelter in the first place. You're welcome at the ranch as long as you need to stay." The ride back to the ranch was quieter than their journey to town had been, both of them processing the morning's events. But as they passed the turnoff to Dry Hollow and headed back toward Cole's land, both felt a sense of relief. Whatever judgment they faced in town seemed less important than the peace they'd found in each other's company. That evening, as they worked together preparing supper, the easy companionship that had been growing between them felt deeper, strengthened by having faced external pressure together. They'd weathered their first real test as allies, and both were surprised by how natural it had felt to stand up for each other. The fifth morning brought an unexpected discovery. Clara had risen early as usual, intending to continue work in the garden before the day grew too warm. While searching the cabin for a better pair of work gloves, she'd opened what she thought was a linen closet, and instead found herself looking at a carefully preserved shrine to Annie Travis. Dresses hung in perfect order, still smelling faintly of lavender sachets. A hairbrush sat on a small table, strands of auburn hair still caught in its bristles. Books were stacked neatly beside a sewing basket that contained half-finished embroidery work, the needle still threaded as if Annie had only stepped away for a moment and might return at any time. Clara stood in the doorway for a long moment, understanding with sudden clarity the depth of Cole's preservation of his wife's memory. This wasn't just a man who'd lost his spouse, this was a man who'd turned his entire life into a monument to that loss. "She kept everything organized," Cole's voice said quietly behind her. Clara turned to find him in the doorway, his face unreadable. "Always knew where everything belonged, always put things back in their proper places." "I'm sorry," Clara said, stepping back from the closet. "I was looking for gloves and didn't realize." "It's all right," Cole said, though his voice carried a weight that suggested it wasn't entirely all right. "You were bound to find it sooner or later. I suppose I should have mentioned it." Clara looked at the preserved clothing, at the careful arrangement of personal items, and felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her understood Cole's need to preserve these tangible connections to his wife. Another part of her wondered what it meant that he'd kept everything exactly as Annie had left it, as if expecting her to return. She was beautiful, Clara said, looking at a small daguerreotype on the table that showed a woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. She was, Cole agreed, inside and out, never met anyone who didn't love Annie within 5 minutes of meeting her. The weight of that statement settled between them. Clara understood that she wasn't just sharing space with Kalish, was sharing it with Annie's ghost, with 15 years of carefully preserved memory and unprocessed grief. "Would you," Cole paused, seeming to struggle with something, "would you like to visit her grave? I go every Sunday after church. Thought maybe you'd understand better if you saw where she rests." The invitation surprised Clara, both for what it offered and what it cost him to make. Taking someone to visit his wife's grave was an act of profound trust, an admission that Clara had become important enough to include in his most private rituals. "I'd be honored," Clara said simply. That afternoon, they rode out to a small rise behind the ranch house where a simple wooden cross marked Annie's resting place. Wildflowers grew around the grave, not planted, but encouraged, creating a natural garden that seemed fitting for a woman who'd loved growing things. Among them, Clara noticed several pressed flowers tucked into Annie's Bible that lay beside the headstone, their colors still vibrant, despite the years. "I bring her flowers every week," Cole said, dismounting and removing his hat. She always said store-bought flowers were pretty, but wild ones had more character. Clara knelt beside the grave, reading the simple inscription, "Annie Travis, beloved wife, 1835, 1860. She found joy in simple things. Below that in smaller letters, until we meet again." "You carved this yourself," Clara observed, running her fingers over the carefully shaped letters. "Took me most of a winter, wanted to get it right." They sat in comfortable silence beside Annie's grave, the afternoon sun warm on their faces. Clara found herself thinking about the woman buried beneath the wildflowers, trying to imagine the life she'd lived and the love she'd shared with Cole. "Tell me about her," Clara said eventually. "Not just that she was beautiful or kind. Tell me something that made her uniquely Annie." Cole was quiet for so long that Clara thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft with memory. "She collected things," he said. "Not valuable things, just things that caught her eye. Unusual stones, feathers, pressed flowers. She'd find them when we were working around the ranch, and she'd bring them back to the house like they were treasures. Said every small, beautiful thing deserved to be noticed and appreciated." He paused, pulling a blade of grass and twisting it between his fingers. "The day before she died, when the fever was worst, she made me promise to keep finding beautiful things. Said that was how I'd know she was still with mine every sunset and wildflower and bird song. Took me 15 years to understand she wasn't asking me to live in the past. She was asking me to keep living in the present." Clara felt tears prick her eyes at the image of a dying woman trying to give her husband permission to continue finding joy in life. "She sounds like she was very wise. Wiser than I gave her credit for," Cole admitted. "I thought preserving everything exactly as she left it was the same as preserving our love. But sitting here with you now, I think maybe I've been preserving my grief instead." The afternoon light was beginning to slant toward evening when Clara finally spoke about her own loss. She told Cole about Thomas's grave in Kansas, hundreds of miles behind her, marked with a simple stone she'd been able to afford only by selling most of their possessions. "I dream about him sometimes," she said. "He's always trying to tell me something important, but I can never quite hear what he's saying. I wake up feeling like I've failed him somehow." "Maybe he's trying to tell you it's all right to let go," Cole suggested. "Is that what you think Annie would tell you?" Cole looked at the wildflowers growing around his wife's grave, at the Bible with its pressed flowers that represented 15 years of weekly visits and careful tending. "I think Annie would wonder why it took me so long to figure out what she was trying to tell me before she died." As they prepared to leave, Cole did something he'd never done before. He picked up Annie's Bible and handed it to Clara. "There are letters in here," he said. "Things she wrote during her last weeks. I've never been able to read them, but maybe you could help me understand what she was trying to say." Clara took the Bible with the reverence due to something sacred, understanding that Cole was entrusting her with the most precious thing he owned. The pressed wild flowers between its pages seemed to whisper of love that transcended death, of beauty preserved not in static remembrance, but in living appreciation. That evening, they sat together on the porch as the sun painted the sky in shades of gold and rose. Clara opened Annie's Bible carefully, revealing pages where pressed flowers alternated with passages of scripture and personal letters written in a feminine hand that grew progressively weaker toward the end. "She wrote this one the day before she died," Clara said softly, indicating a letter that filled barely half a page. "Would you like me to read it?" Cole nodded, his hands gripping the arms of his chair. "My dearest Cole," Clara began, "if you are reading this, then I am gone, and you have finally found the courage to look for my final words. I hope it has not taken you too long, my love. I hope you have not spent years preserving our past at the expense of your future." Clara's voice trembled slightly as she continued reading Annie's letter in the golden evening light. "I know you, my stubborn, faithful husband. I know you will want to carry your grief like a badge of honor, to prove your love by the depth of your sorrow. But love is not meant to be a burden, Cole. It is meant to be a gift that keeps giving, even after the giver is gone." Cole's breathing had grown shallow, his knuckles white where he gripped the porch rail. 15 years of wondering what his dying wife had tried to tell him, and now her words were flowing over him like water over parched ground. "Do not make me the reason you stop living," Clara continued, her own eyes filling with tears as she read the careful script. "Make me the reason you remember how beautiful life can be. Find someone who makes you laugh again, who brings joy to this ranch that we built together. Love her with the same faithful heart you gave to me, and know that somewhere beyond the stars, I am smiling to see you happy." The letter went on, but Cole raised his hand, unable to hear more. He stood abruptly and walked to the edge of the porch, his back to Clara, his shoulders rigid with emotion. Clara closed the Bible gently and set it aside, giving Cole time to process what he'd heard. The evening air was soft and warm, filled with the scent of the wildflowers she'd been tending in Annie's old garden. A sprig of wild sage lay on the porch rail where she'd placed it earlier, planning to dry it for cooking. Now it seemed to mock her with its connection to Annie's memory. "She knew," Cole said finally, his voice rough. "She knew I'd turn our love into a prison for myself." "She loved you enough to worry about your future," Clara said softly. "Even when she was dying, she was thinking about your happiness." Cole turned around, his face etched with 15 years of accumulated pain and confusion. "I don't know how to let go," he admitted. "I don't know how to love someone without feeling like I'm betraying everything Annie and I shared." Clara stood and moved to join him at the porch rail, careful not to touch him, but close enough that he could feel her presence. "Maybe letting go isn't about forgetting," she suggested. "Maybe it's about taking what was beautiful in what you had with Annie and allowing it to make room for something new. Is that what you did with Thomas?" Clara considered the question honestly. "I'm still learning, but I think Thomas would be happy to know I've found someone who makes me want to try again." The admission hung in the air between them, honest and vulnerable. Cole looked at Clara as if seeing her clearly for the first time, as a temporary guest or a reminder of what he'd lost, but as a woman who'd brought light back into his carefully darkened world. The next morning, Clara was working in the garden when Cole approached with a bundle of seedlings he'd purchased in town the previous week, but forgotten in his wagon. "Tomatoes," he said, kneeling beside her in the dirt. "Annie always said you couldn't have a proper garden without good tomatoes." They worked together to plant the seedlings, their hands occasionally brushing as they passed tools or reached for the same patch of earth. The garden was flourishing under Clara's care, the vegetables Annie had once grown returning to vigorous life after years of neglect. "It's beautiful," Clara said, sitting back to survey their work. "Annie would be proud to see it thriving again." "She'd be proud of you for bringing it back to life," Cole said, and something in his tone made Clara look at him more closely. He was staring at her with an intensity that made her pulse quicken, his green eyes holding emotions she was afraid to interpret correctly. Dirt smudged her cheek, and her hair had come loose from its practical braid, but the way Cole was looking at her made her feel beautiful in a way she hadn't experienced in years. "Clara," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. She knew what was coming, could see it in the way his gaze dropped to her lips and then back to her eyes. She should have pulled away, should have maintained the careful distance they'd established. Instead, she found herself leaning slightly toward him, her heart hammering against her ribs. When Cole kissed her, it was gentle and tentative, as if he expected her to disappear at any moment. Clara's hands came up to rest against his chest, feeling the rapid beat of his heart beneath her palms. For a moment that felt like forever, they existed in a bubble of perfect rightness, surrounded by the growing things they'd tended together, breathing the same air, sharing the same hope. Then reality crashed back over both of them like cold water. Cole pulled away abruptly, his face flushing with what looked like shame. "I'm sorry," he said, scrambling to his feet. "I shouldn't have. That was inappropriate." Clara remained on her knees in the garden dirt, her fingers touching her lips where she could still feel the warmth of his kiss. "Cole," she began, but he was already backing away from her. "I need to check the fence line," he said, not meeting her eyes. "I'll be back by evening." He strode away toward the barn, leaving Clara alone among the vegetables and wildflowers. She could see the tension in his shoulders, the way he held himself like a man fleeing from something dangerous. The kiss had felt right to her, natural and long overdue, but she understood that for Cole it represented a betrayal of everything he'd held sacred for 15 years. That afternoon, while Cole was gone, Clara found herself walking back to Annie's grave. She knelt beside the simple wooden cross, feeling foolish, but needing to address the woman whose shadow lay across everything that was happening between her and Cole. "I don't know if you can hear me," Clara said quietly, "but I need you to know that I'm not trying to replace you. I could never be what you were to him, and I wouldn't want to try. But I think I could be something different, something that honors what you two shared while still being my own." The wind stirred the wildflowers around the grave, and Clara chose to take it as a response. She picked up the sprig of wild sage she'd brought with her and placed it among the other flowers, a gesture of respect and understanding. When Cole returned that evening, he was distant and formal, calling her Mrs. Jessup instead of Clara and avoiding her eyes during their quiet supper. The easy companionship they'd built over the past week had been replaced by an awkward tension that neither seemed to know how to address. "The wheel should be finished tomorrow," Cole said as they cleaned up after their meal. "Pete sent word that you'll be able to continue your journey to California." The statement hit Clara like a physical blow. After everything they'd shared, after the growing intimacy and the kiss that had felt like a promise, Cole was reminding her that she was still just a temporary visitor in his life. "Of course," she said, keeping her voice steady despite the hurt blooming in her chest. "I should start gathering my things." They said goodnight with careful politeness, but Clara could see the pain in Cole's eyes that matched her own. He was choosing loyalty to a ghost over the possibility of love with a living woman, and they were both going to pay the price for that choice. That night, Cole lay awake staring at the ceiling of his bedroom, tormented by the memory of Clara's lips beneath his and the look of hurt in her eyes when he'd pulled away. The kiss had felt like coming alive after years of merely existing, but it had also felt like betrayal of the deepest kind. How could he love another woman when he'd promised Annie she was the only one? Unable to sleep, he rose and lit a lamp, then did something he'd avoided for 15 years. He pulled up the loose floorboards beside Annie's old sewing chair and retrieved her diary with trembling hands. Clara had read only part of the final letter yesterday evening. Perhaps the complete truth lay somewhere in these pages truth he'd been too afraid to face until now. Annie's handwriting filled the early pages with the neat precision he remembered, chronicling their daily life with the careful attention of someone who found joy in small details. She wrote about the garden, about their hopes for children, about the way Cole sang old hymns while he worked. But as Cole read deeper, moving closer to her final weeks, he began to see things he'd missed or forgotten in his grief. "I know Cole blames himself for our childlessness," read one entry from 2 years before her death. "He sees it as his failure, but the doctor was clear that the fault lies with me. I pray someday he will find a woman who can give him the family I never could. It breaks my heart to think of him growing old alone because of my inadequacies." Cole's hands shook as he read. He'd forgotten Annie's conversations with the town doctor, her quiet tears when her monthly courses continued to come despite their hopes. He'd been so consumed with his own disappointment that he'd missed the weight of shame she'd carried. He turned more pages, finding entries that revealed the depth of Annie's understanding of his character. She wrote about his tendency to carry guilt that didn't belong to him, his loyal heart that sometimes became a burden. She documented her growing awareness that the fever would take her, and her increasing worry about what her death would do to him. "Cole will try to make our love into a monument," she wrote 3 weeks before her death. "He will preserve everything exactly as I left it and call it faithfulness. But true faithfulness would be taking the love we shared and using it to build something new. I wish I could make him understand that loving someone else after I'm gone wouldn't diminish what we had. It would prove how well I taught him to love." The words hit Cole like physical blows. Annie had known him so well, had predicted exactly how he would respond to losing her. She'd seen his future path of self-imposed isolation and tried to leave him breadcrumbs to find his way back to life. He found the letter Clara had begun reading the previous evening and continued where she'd left off. "I have watched you with the animals that are hurt or frightened, my love. You have such gentleness in your hands, such patience in your heart. Some woman will need that gentleness someday. Some woman will deserve the faithful love you gave to me. Promise me you won't let my death be the end of your capacity for joy. There is something else I must tell you, something I should have said years ago but was too proud to admit. The doctor believes my inability to bear children is God's way of preparing you for a different path. He thinks you have too much love in your heart to waste it on an empty house and preserved memories. I used to resent that idea, but as death approaches, I find wisdom in it. Do not spend your life apologizing to my ghost, Cole. I release you from any promise of eternal faithfulness. I want you to love again, to marry again, to fill this ranch with the children I could never give you. Find a woman who laughs at your terrible jokes and argues with your stubborn opinions. Find someone who will tend my garden and make it bloom even more beautifully than I ever could. And when you do find her, because I know you will, even if it takes you years to work up the courage, know that loving her is not a betrayal of what we shared. It is the fulfillment of it. Love her with all the faithfulness you showed me, and know that somewhere beyond the stars, I am celebrating your happiness. Your devoted wife, even in death, Annie. P.S. I have hidden this letter where only deliberate searching will find it. If you are reading this, it means you have finally decided to stop hiding from life. I am so proud of you for taking that first step. Cole read the letter 3 times before its full meaning penetrated the wall of guilt he'd built around his heart. Annie hadn't just given him permission to love again, she'd begged him to. She'd seen his future loneliness as clearly as she'd seen his tendency toward self-punishment, and she'd tried to save him from both. But it was the postscript that broke him completely. Annie had known he would preserve her things exactly as she'd left them. She'd known he would avoid reading her final thoughts until something or someone forced him to confront them. She'd hidden the letter not to make it harder to find, but to ensure he would only find it when he was finally ready to hear what she had to say. Cole wept then, for the first time since Annie's funeral. He wept for 15 years of misplaced loyalty, for the life he'd wasted in service to grief, for the woman whose wisdom he'd ignored in favor of his own stubborn guilt. But mostly, he wept for Annie herself, the woman who'd loved him enough to spend her dying days worrying about his future happiness. When the tears finally stopped, Cole felt something he hadn't experienced in 15 years. Peace. The weight he'd carried for so long was lifting, replaced not by emptiness, but by a strange lightness. Annie had been trying to set him free, and he'd spent a decade and a half building his own prison instead. Dawn was breaking when Cole finally closed the diary and returned it to its hiding place. He dressed quickly and walked out to Annie's grave, where he knelt beside the wooden cross he'd carved with such careful devotion. "I'm sorry," he said aloud, his voice carrying across the empty morning. "I'm sorry it took me so long to listen. I'm sorry I turned your love into a burden instead of a gift. But I'm ready now, Annie. I'm ready to live the life you wanted me to have." He picked one of the wild sage blossoms from around her grave and tucked it into his vest pocket, next to the place where he'd carried her wedding ring for 15 years. Then he stood and walked back toward the cabin, where Clara would soon be waking to pack for her journey to California. He found her in the barn, already dressed and organizing her few possessions with the efficient movements of someone who'd learned to travel light. She looked up when he entered, her face carefully neutral despite the pain he could see in her eyes. "The wheel's finished," she said without preamble. "I thought I'd collect it this morning and be on my way. I don't want to impose on your hospitality any longer than necessary." Cole pulled Annie's diary from beneath his shirt and held it out to her. "I need you to read something," he said. "I need you to read the rest of Annie's letter." Clara looked at the diary with something like fear. "Cole, I don't think that's—" "Please," he said, and something in his voice made her take the book from his hands. He watched her face as she read Annie's complete final message, saw her eyes widen with understanding and then fill with tears. When she finished, she looked up at him with an expression he couldn't quite interpret. "She knew," Clara whispered. "She knew exactly what you would do, and she tried to stop you from doing it. I've been living the opposite of the life she wanted me to have," Cole said. "I've been honoring my grief instead of honoring her love. But I understand now, Clara. I understand what she was trying to tell me." Clara closed the diary carefully, her hands trembling slightly. "What are you saying, Cole?" Cole moved closer, close enough to see the flecks of gold in her brown eyes, close enough to smell the lavender soap she used to wash her hair. "I'm saying that Annie gave me permission to love you 15 years ago, and I've been too stubborn and scared to accept it. I'm saying that kissing you yesterday felt like the first honest thing I've done since she died. And I'm saying," he continued, reaching into his vest pocket and pulling out both Annie's wedding ring and the wild sage blossom he'd picked from her grave, "that I'd like to ask you to stay. Not just until your wagon is repaired, but permanently. I'd like to ask you to marry me, Clara Jessup, and help me turn this monument to the past into a home for the future." Clara stared at Cole as if he'd spoken in a foreign language. The proposal hung in the air between them, like something fragile and impossible, beautiful in its sincerity, but terrifying in its implications. She looked down at Annie's wedding ring in his palm, at the wild sage blossom that carried the blessing of the dead, and felt her carefully constructed plans for the future crumble like old paper. "Cole," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the morning sounds of the ranch. "Two can't. My wagon is repaired. I have a job waiting in California. I've already made arrangements." "Arrangements can be changed," Cole said gently, but Clara was already shaking her head. "You don't understand. I've spent 2 years planning this journey, saving every penny to make it possible. My cousin is expecting me. There's a boarding house to manage, a new life waiting." She pulled out a leather-bound journal from her traveling bag, its pages filled with careful notes and sketches. "Look," she said, opening it to show him detailed plans for her future in California. "I've researched everything, the routes, the costs, the opportunities. I know exactly what I'm walking into out there." Cole looked at the journal, seeing pages covered with Clara's neat handwriting, maps of California towns, calculations of expenses, and potential earnings. This wasn't a woman fleeing on impulse. This was someone who'd methodically planned her escape from grief and built her hopes around a specific vision of the future. "Clara," he said carefully, "what if there was something better than what you've planned? What if there was something you didn't know you wanted until you found it?" Clara closed the journal abruptly, clutching it against her chest like armor. I can't build my life around what-ifs, Cole. I learned that when Thomas died. I learned that the only person you can count on to take care of you is yourself. The words stung, though Cole knew they weren't meant as an attack on him personally. They were the hard-won wisdom of someone who'd lost the person she'd depended on most, and had to rebuild her entire existence from nothing. What if you didn't have to take care of yourself alone? Cole asked. What if you had someone to share the burden with? Clara looked away, unable to meet his eyes. I thought I had that with Thomas. I thought we'd grow old together, maybe have children, build something lasting. When he died, all those dreams died with him. I can't go through that kind of loss again, Cole. I won't survive it a second time. Cole understood then that this wasn't really about California or job prospects or careful planning. This was about fear, the deep, bone-level terror of loving someone enough to lose them completely. I can't promise you'll never lose me, Cole said quietly. Life doesn't offer those kinds of guarantees. But I can promise that whatever time we have, we'll make it count. We'll build something beautiful together, something that honors both Thomas and Annie while still being completely ours. Clara wiped tears from her eyes with the back of her hand, still holding her journal like a lifeline. It's not that simple, isn't it? Cole stepped closer, his voice gaining strength. Clara, I've spent 15 years living in the past because I was afraid of the future. Don't make the same mistake I did. Don't let fear of what might happen keep you from what could happen. The morning was getting warmer, and they could hear the sounds of Dry Hollow coming to life in the distance. Soon, Pete Morrison would be expecting Clara to collect her repaired wheel. Soon, the decision would be forced upon them by circumstances rather than made through careful consideration. I need time to think, Clara said finally. This is too important to decide in a moment of emotion. Cole nodded, though every instinct in his body was screaming at him to press harder, to convince her before she could build her defenses too high. How much time? Give me the day, Clara said. Let me collect my wheel, settle my business in town, and think about what you're asking. If I'm going to change my entire life, I need to do it with a clear head. They rode to town together in silence, both lost in their own thoughts. The wagon wheel was indeed ready, expertly crafted and perfectly fitted. Pete Morrison had outdone himself, creating something that would carry Clara safely to California if that's what she chose. As Pete and Cole loaded the wheel onto the wagon, Clara found herself studying every detail of Dry Hollow with new eyes. Was this a place she could call home? Could she build a life in this small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, where her unconventional arrival would be remembered and discussed for years to come? While the men worked, Clara walked to the general store, ostensibly to purchase supplies for her journey, but really to test her own feelings about staying versus leaving. Mrs. Patterson was behind the counter, her sharp eyes taking in every detail of Clara's appearance. Well, Mrs. Jessup, the older woman said with forced cheer, I understand you'll be continuing your journey today. Such a shame you won't be staying longer in our little community. The words were polite, but Clara could hear the satisfaction beneath them. Mrs. Patterson had clearly decided that Clara's departure would solve whatever impropriety she imagined was occurring at the Travis ranch. Perhaps, Clara said noncommittally, selecting items from the shelves without really seeing them. Oh? Are you having second thoughts about California? Mrs. Patterson's voice sharpened with interest. Clara found herself thinking about Cole's defense of her the previous week, the way he'd stood up to Jake Morrison's crude implications. She thought about the respect in Reverend Matthew's voice, the warmth in Pete Morrison's greeting. Not everyone in Dry Hollow was as judgmental as Mrs. Patterson, though she seemed to be the loudest voice in whatever social hierarchy existed here. I'm considering all my options, Clara said diplomatically. She completed her purchases and walked back outside, where she found Cole and Pete engaged in conversation beside her wagon. Both men looked up as she approached, and she saw hope flicker in Cole's eyes, despite his attempt to appear neutral. All set? Cole asked. Clara nodded, though her heart was far from settled. They loaded her purchases and prepared to return to the ranch, where she would need to make the most important decision of her life. The ride back was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the morning's tension had been. This was the silence of two people giving each other space to think, both understanding that words spoken now could push the decision in directions that shouldn't be forced. Back at the ranch, Cole busied himself with afternoon chores, while Clara sat on the porch with her journal, attempting to make lists of advantages and disadvantages for each path. But every time she tried to write logical arguments for leaving, she found herself remembering the feel of Cole's kiss in the garden, the way he'd looked at her when he talked about Annie's blessings, the sense of rightness she'd felt working beside him in the restored garden. On the other side of the page, her arguments for staying kept coming back to one central point. She was falling in love with Cole Travis, and he was falling in love with her, and that love felt different from what she'd shared with Thomas. Not better or worse, but different, deeper, perhaps. For having been tested by loss and seasoned by grief. As afternoon stretched toward evening, Clara found herself walking to Annie's grave again. She knelt beside the wooden cross, her journal open in her lap, and spoke aloud to the woman who'd become an unexpected ally in her emotional journey. "I don't know what to do," Clara said to the silent grave. "Part of me thinks this is all happening too fast, that I'm making decisions based on emotion rather than good sense. But another part of me thinks that maybe good sense is overrated when it comes to matters of the heart." The wild sage around the grave swayed in the afternoon breeze, and Clara found herself remembering the passage from Annie's letter about faithfulness being the ability to take love and build something new with it. "Is that what you want?" Clara asked. "Do you want me to love him the way he loved you? Because I can't promise to be the same kind of wife you were. I can't promise to fill the same spaces in his life, or bring him the same kinds of joy." The silence stretched on, but Clara felt something settling in her chest, a sense of certainty that had nothing to do with practical considerations or careful planning. "But I can promise to love him completely," she said aloud. "I can promise to make him laugh and argue with his stubborn opinions and tend your garden with all the care you would have wanted. I can promise to help him build something new without forgetting what came before." When she returned to the cabin, as the sun was setting, Clara found Cole sitting on the porch steps, Annie's wedding ring still in his palm. He looked up as she approached, his face carefully neutral despite the hope she could see in his eyes. "I've made my decision," Clara said, settling beside him on the steps. Cole waited, not speaking, giving her space to find her own words. "I'm scared," Clara said honestly. "I'm terrified of loving someone again, of building dreams that might get crushed by circumstances beyond my control. But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to stay." She reached out and took Annie's wedding ring from Cole's palm, feeling its weight and warmth. "If you'll have me, Cole Travis, I'd like to make this ranch my home. I'd like to help you turn it into something Annie would be proud of while still making it completely ours." Cole's face lit up like sunrise, and when he kissed her this time, there was no guilt or hesitation in it. Only joy and promise and the sweet relief of two people who'd finally found the courage to choose love over fear. The morning after Clara's acceptance should have been perfect, but the sky told a different story. Black clouds massed on the western horizon like an advancing army, and the air carried that peculiar stillness that warned of violent weather to come. Cole stood on his porch, coffee growing cold in his hands, reading the signs with the expertise of a man who'd weathered 30 Montana storms. "We're in for a rough one," he said to Clara as she joined him, her own gaze fixed on the approaching tempest. "How rough?" Clara asked, though the green-tinged darkness of the clouds already suggested an answer she might not want to hear. "Rough enough that you won't be traveling anywhere for a day or two," Cole replied. "These spring storms can drop hail big as hen's eggs and winds strong enough to flip a wagon. We'll need to secure everything that's not nailed down." They spent the morning in frantic preparation, bringing in tools and equipment, checking the barn doors and windows, making sure the livestock had access to shelter. Clara worked alongside Cole with the competence of someone who'd weathered harsh weather before, but she could see him casting worried glances at the sky as the storm clouds grew larger and more menacing. By noon, the first winds were beginning to gust, rattling the windows of the cabin and bending the cottonwoods near the creek. Cole retrieved his father's storm lantern from the barn, sturdy brass and glass construction that had guided the Travis family through dozens of dark nights over the years. "This belonged to your father?" Clara asked, examining the well-maintained lantern. "His father before him," Cole said, checking the wick and oil level. "Been through more storms than I can count. Never failed us yet." The lantern seemed to represent something beyond its practical purpose, a beacon of reliability and hope, passed down through generations of men who'd faced adversity and survived it. Clara found comfort in holding something so solid and dependable as the storm gathered strength outside. The first real fury hit around 2 in the afternoon. Rain came in sheets, driven horizontal by winds that howled like living things. Hail followed, starting small but quickly growing to the size Cole had predicted, drumming against the roof and walls with a sound like gunfire. They huddled in the cabin, the storm lantern providing steady light as the day turned dark as evening. Through the windows, they could see the world transformed into something alien and terrifying. Trees bent almost to breaking, debris flying through the air, water running in rivers where dry ground had been that morning. "The barn," Cole said suddenly, his face going pale as he peered through the rain-lashed window. "Something's wrong with the barn." Clara looked where he was pointing and saw what had caught his attention. Smoke was rising from the barn's roof, barely visible through the driving rain, but unmistakably real. "Lightning strike," Cole said, already reaching for his coat. "The whole thing could go up in minutes." "You can't go out in this," Clara protested, grabbing his arm as thunder crashed overhead with earth-shaking intensity. "The horses are in there," Cole said grimly. "Your horses and mine, plus the cattle, took shelter there when the hail started. I won't let them burn alive because I was too afraid to get wet." He was right, and they both knew it. The animals trapped in the burning barn would die if someone didn't help them, and Cole was the only one with the strength and experience to handle panicked livestock in dangerous conditions. "Then I'm coming with you," Clara said, reaching for her own coat. "Absolutely not. This is not the time for chivalry." Clara interrupted, her voice firm despite the fear he could see in her eyes. "You'll need help getting the animals out, and I know horses. We don't have time to argue." Cole started to protest again, but another crash of thunder and a brighter glow from the barn's direction settled the matter. They wrapped themselves in oilskins and stepped out into the storm's fury. The wind hit them like a physical blow, nearly knocking Clara off her feet. Cole caught her arm and pulled her close, shouting to be heard over the howling air. "Stay right behind me. Don't let go." They fought their way across the yard, slipping in mud and dodging flying debris. A loose shingle from the cabin's roof sailed past Clara's head, missing her by inches. The storm lantern in Cole's hand provided the only light in the premature darkness, its steady flame somehow surviving the chaos around them. The barn was worse than they'd feared. Lightning had struck the roof near the hayloft, and flames were spreading despite the driving rain. Smoke poured out of the building, and they could hear the terrified sounds of the animals trapped inside. "The horses first," Cole shouted, handing Clara the lantern. "They're closest to the door." The rescue became a blur of smoke, flame, and animal panic. Clara held the lantern steady, while Cole fought to calm horses mad with fear, leading them one by one out of the burning building and into the storm. Her skirts were soaked and heavy, her hair whipped free of its pins, but she never faltered. On her third trip into the barn to help with the cattle, a burning beam cracked overhead with a sound like breaking bones. Clara looked up just in time to see it falling toward her, too large and too close to dodge. Cole's shout of warning was the last thing she heard before the world went dark. Clara woke to the gentle pressure of a cool cloth against her forehead and the soft glow of lamplight. Her head throbbed with each heartbeat, and when she tried to sit up, the world spun dangerously. "Easy," Cole's voice said, his hand steadying her shoulder. "You took a hard knock. The doctor said you need to stay still." "The animals?" Clara asked, her voice hoarse from smoke. "All safe. Every last one, thanks to you." Cole's face was streaked with soot and worry, his clothes torn and singed from their battle with the fire. "Clara, you could have been killed. That beam missed, crushing you by inches." The memory came back in fragments, the cracking sound overhead, the falling timber, Cole's desperate shout. She reached up to touch the bandage wrapped around her head, feeling the tender spot where the beam had struck a glancing blow. "How long was I unconscious?" "Most of the night. It's nearly dawn now." Cole's voice carried a tremor that spoke of hours spent fearing the worst. "Dr. Hayes said you were lucky a concussion, but nothing broken. Said you've got a hard head." Despite her pain, Clara smiled at that. "Thomas used to say the same thing." Cole was quiet for a moment, his green eyes studying her face with an intensity that made her pulse quicken despite her injury. "Clara, I need to tell you something. When I saw that beam falling toward you, when I thought I might lose you." He stopped, struggling with words that seemed too large for his voice to carry. "What?" Clara prompted gently. "I understood what Annie meant," Cole said, his voice barely above a whisper, "about love not being diminished by sharing it. When I thought you were going to die, I felt like I was losing a part of myself I didn't even know I had. But it wasn't the same as losing Annie. It was different, not better or worse, just completely different." Clara reached for his hand, finding it warm and steady despite the tremor in his voice. "I love you, Clara Jessup," Cole said, the words coming easier now. "I love your practical nature and your gentle strength. I love the way you brought life back to Annie's garden and light back to this ranch. I love that you were brave enough to risk yourself for animals that weren't even yours." Clara felt tears prick her eyes, though whether from emotion or her head injury, she couldn't say. "And I want to spend whatever time we have left making you happy," Cole continued. "I want to marry you properly, with the whole town as witnesses. I want to fill this house with the sound of your laughter, and maybe, if we're blessed, with children who'll grow up knowing they're loved." Cole reached into his vest pocket and pulled out 2 rings, Annie's gold band and another ring Clara hadn't seen before, this one with a small but clear diamond. "This was my grandmother's ring," Cole said, showing her the diamond. "My grandfather gave it to her when they'd been married 20 years, said it was to celebrate all the storms they'd weathered together. Seems fitting after tonight." Clara looked at the 2 rings, representing Cole's past love, the other representing their future together. "What about Annie's ring? I thought maybe we could take it to her grave together." Cole said carefully, "Leave it there as a way of saying goodbye and thank you. She gave me permission to love again. Seems right that we should tell her we're taking her advice." Clara nodded, understanding the symbolism. They would honor Annie's memory by releasing the physical tokens of grief while keeping the emotional lessons of love. "Cole Travis," Clara said, her voice growing stronger despite her injuries. "I never thought I'd love anyone the way I love Thomas. But you're right, this is different. It's deeper, maybe, for having been tested by loss. It's wiser for having learned that love is precious because it's temporary." She looked at the diamond ring, then back at Cole's hopeful face. "I'd be honored to be your wife. I'd be proud to help you turn this ranch into a home filled with joy, instead of just memories." Cole slipped the ring onto her finger with hands that shook slightly from emotion and exhaustion. It fit perfectly, as if it had been waiting for her all along. "We'll need to write to your cousin in California," Cole said. "Let her know you've changed your plans. And we'll need to plan a wedding," Clara added. "I suppose Mrs. Patterson will have opinions about the proper way to do things." Cole laughed at that, the sound rich and warm in the lamplight. "Let her talk. We'll do things our way with respect for what came before and hope for what comes next." Outside, the storm had passed, leaving behind the clean smell of rain-washed earth and the promise of a new day. As dawn light crept through the windows, Cole and Clara sat together holding hands, 2 people who'd found love in unexpected places and chosen courage over fear. They had survived the storm together, both the one that had raged outside and the one that had been building in their hearts since the day they met. Now they could begin building something new from the ashes of their grief, something that honored their past while embracing their future. 6 months later, autumn painted the Montana landscape in shades of gold and crimson that would have taken Clara's breath away if she weren't so accustomed to the daily beauty of her new home. She stood in what had once been Annie's garden, now flourishing under her care with vegetables and flowers that spoke of careful tending and abundant love. The ranch bore a new wooden sign that Cole had carved during the long summer evenings, its letters burned deep into seasoned oak. Travis Ranch, home of Cole, Clara. The sign hung proudly by the main gate, visible to anyone who traveled the road to Dry Hollow, announcing to the world that this was no longer a monument to the past, but a working ranch built for the future. Clara's transformation of the place had been gentle but thorough. She'd kept the things that mattered: Annie's books, her pressed flower collection, the photograph that showed her gentle smile, but she'd also brought her own touches to every room. Bright curtains replaced heavy drapes. Fresh flowers appeared in vases that had sat empty for 15 years. The kitchen became a place where meals were shared and conversation flowed, rather than a space where a solitary man ate in silence. The townspeople of Dry Hollow had eventually warmed to Clara, though it had taken time and patience. Mrs. Patterson still offered unsolicited advice about proper behavior, but even she had grudgingly admitted that Cole seemed more like his old self since marrying Clara. The wedding itself had been simple but well attended, with Reverend Matthews performing the ceremony in the little church, while most of the town looked on with curiosity and, eventually, approval. Pete Morrison had become a particular friend, often stopping by the ranch to share news from town and admire the improvements Clara had made to the property. Even Jake Morrison, properly chastened after his earlier rudeness, had offered awkward but sincere congratulations when he encountered them in the general store. On this particular afternoon, Clara was harvesting the last of the season's tomatoes when she heard Cole's voice calling from the barn. There was something in his tone, excitement mixed with barely contained joy, that made her set down her basket and hurry toward the sound. She found him in the barn, standing beside one of their mares with the widest smile she'd seen on his face since their wedding day. "Daisy's foaling season was more successful than we thought," Cole said, unable to keep the grin from his voice. "Look." Clara approached the stall and saw what had captured Cole's attention. Daisy stood proudly beside a wobbly-legged foal, dark brown with white markings, that couldn't have been more than a few hours old. "Oh," Clara breathed, her hand going instinctively to her own belly where her pregnancy was just beginning to show. "Cole, he's beautiful." Cole corrected gently. "And yes, she is. First foal born on this ranch in 15 years. Clara understood the significance immediately. Like their own impending child, the foal represented new life returning to a place that had been static for too long. She watched the little horse try to stand on uncertain legs, saw Daisy's patient encouragement, and felt a warmth spread through her chest that had nothing to do with the autumn sun streaming through the barn windows. "What should we name her?" Clara asked. Cole considered this seriously, studying the foal's markings and temperament. "Annie always said new life deserved a name that spoke of hope," he said finally. "What do you think of Promise?" Clara nodded, understanding that the name honored Annie's memory while celebrating their own future. Promise is perfect. That evening, they rode out to Annie's grave as they did every Sunday, bringing fresh wildflowers and news of the week's happenings. Clara had initially felt strange about these visits, uncertain whether she was intruding on Cole's private grief. But over the months, she'd come to see them as conversations with a friend. Annie's wisdom and love had become part of the foundation of her own marriage, and she felt grateful rather than resentful for that influence. "We have news," Cole said to the simple wooden cross, settling beside Clara in the grass. "The foal was born today, and Clara's carrying our first child." Clara smiled at his matter-of-fact tone, the way he included Annie in their joy, as naturally as he might share news with any beloved family member. They'd learned to speak of Annie often, to include her memory in their daily life, without being haunted by it. "Dr. Hayes thinks the baby will come in the spring," Clara added, placing her hand on her still small belly, "right around the time the wildflowers start blooming." They sat in comfortable silence as the sun set behind the mountains, painting the sky in the brilliant colors that Annie had loved. Clara leaned against Cole's shoulder, feeling the solid warmth of him, the quiet strength that had drawn her to him from the very beginning. "Do you think she'd be happy?" Clara asked, though she thought she already knew the answer. "I think Annie would say we're living exactly the life she wanted us to have," Cole replied, his arm tightening around his wife. "Full of love, full of hope, full of the kind of joy that makes all the hard times worthwhile." As they prepared to leave, Clara placed her usual wildflower bouquet beside the grave. But this time she added something newer, small sprig of sage from her garden, the same plant that grew wild around Annie's resting place. It seemed fitting, a bridge between past and present that honored what had been while celebrating what was to come. On the ride back to the ranch, Clara looked up at the stars, beginning to appear in the darkening sky. Cole had taught her to read their patterns during the long summer nights, showing her the constellations that had guided travelers and farmers for generations. "There," Cole said, pointing to a familiar grouping of stars. "That's the one Annie used to call the Promise Keeper, always there, always reliable, always pointing toward home." Clara followed his gaze, seeing in those distant lights the same hope that filled her heart. They had both traveled long, difficult roads to reach this place, but they had arrived together, carrying the wisdom of their losses and the courage to build something new. Behind them, the ranch house glowed with warm lamplight, waiting to welcome them home to the life they'd chosen to build, together, a life that honored the past while embracing all the beautiful possibilities of the future.